Discussing the aggressive upside approach for three of our favorite players in 2023. We're going to look at two rookies and one veteran, and I'm looking forward to getting Shawn's thoughts on these. Taking this information from a couple of recent articles Shawn has wrote up on rotoviz.com. And as always, if you're looking to sign up over at RotoViz, you can use the promo code RVRadio2023 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount. Shawn, this should be a lot of fun. We have had some conversations about one of these players in particular. There's been glancing conversations about a second one that is a rookie. There's one of them that the listeners will not be surprised that is one of our favorite targets in 2023. We're going to go through all three. So I'm going to kick off with the veteran. But as we get through into our Wednesday edition of RotoViz Overtime, I hope all the listeners out there are happy and having a good week so far. We obviously did our show that came out on Monday, looking at some of the dynasty startup elements over at the FFPC and the RotoViz Triflex format in particular. Yourself and Bjorn are drafting at the moment. I know you're ongoing in that process. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out as you go round by round through it. But how are you doing at the midweek point here?
Good. I mean, this is the best time of the year for fantasy, and we're starting to get some real news. And Colm, one of the things that we will have for subscribers on the site is a steady stream of news, but not just reporting the most recent thing that happened at training camp, but trying to put that in perspective, giving drafters a feel for how to take that information and put it into context. Think about these players and what their baseline is, where they're moving in drafts, how you would use them tactically. And so it's been a lot of fun to get some news on guys that is meaningful. Now, I almost feel like I jinxed Breece Hall because I had an article that I think people enjoyed and had a lot of great evidence about Breece. And as a result of that, the Jets have gone out and made some decisions that seem fairly questionable. We hope that won't happen for some of our other guys. But today, Colm, we're going to jump in with a young running back who, he looks like he's set to light the world on fire.
This particular player, it is Javonte Williams. And I had mentioned in a couple of shows that if he wasn't coming off his injury, we probably would see him closer to where Breece Hall had been going previously in that third or fourth round range. So we're going to talk through why that may be a real plus here as we get the discount on him where we think he should be going. He did avoid the PUP, and obviously that there means that we're hoping that he's pretty healthy at this stage, that he's going to head into the season healthy. We're still seeing Shawn, J.K. Dobbins and some concerns around him and his injury recovery from last season. And so Javonte seems to be on a pretty good scale here as he comes back into action pretty early in the camp scenario. So we're looking at one of my favorite things, Shawn, looking to the 2024 draft and how the first round, second round may play out. And that you mentioned in this article, it's the main question you ask yourself when you're drafting any player. Is it highly likely that there will be will they be more substantially expensive next season? So I guess, Shawn, the first question is there a chance that we see him go from where he is now to that first or second round in 2024?
A lot of that is going to depend on the overall environment that we get for player scoring, because one of the things that you see very accurate information on this, but when analysts are looking at 2022 and 2021 and trying to see what worked, you're thrown off by a couple of different trends that are at least somewhat unlikely, which is, number one, that in 2021, we had all of those 0 RB stars hit during the fantasy playoffs and really swamp the R1 running backs. That's a little bit unusual. One of the things that running back drafters could really rely on as the foundation piece of their argument for so many years is that you would have that star running back who would put up a big 3-week stretch in the fantasy playoffs, and you would want that almost regardless of what else happened. Then you look at 2022, and you have these guys, really the four main players who emerge from the dead zone. And when you get that much scoring out of that range, and it's going to make it look like 0 RB works, right? That it's the dominant approach, and now everybody wants to chase that because of the things that have happened in the last 2 years. Now, we would argue that it's been very clear for a decade that that's the way that you want to go. But whether or not we're going to have running backs jump into that first round range to the 1-2 turn, and we still have some guys there this year, right? You still have Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, Bijan Robinson. And yet, if we're going to put guys like a Breece Hall, even if he's splitting time, if we're going to have guys like a Javonte Williams rise up to the 1-2 turn, not only are they going to have to score well themselves, but you're going to have to see some overall scoring trends that get people a little bit more juiced about those early round running backs. Again, we've drafted some teams that would take advantage of that. We've drafted, obviously, plenty of very wide receiver heavy teams, as that's what we believe works year in and year out. But Colm, when we look at Javonte Williams specifically, I think you can make a very strong argument. One of the things that I do here in this article is pull up the Great Advanced Stats tool, where we can look at what he was doing there 2 years ago as a rookie. And it was interesting because if you look specifically at broken tackle percentage, and often we're going to look at that and forced missed tackle percentage together, we're going to look at evasion rate. But when you look at broken tackle percentage, the two top backs that season were rookies. The only two guys with at least 100 carries, and we did have a few people in that 75 to 100 range, but the only two guys with at least 100 carries who broke tackles at that 15% rate were Williams and then Aaron Jones last year. That's for the last 2 years. The best two guys in 2021, Javonte Williams or Ramondre Stevenson, both of those guys average over 3 yards after contact. Both of them are at 14 or above. Javonte Williams easily leads the NFL with 17% broken tackles. You look at what Ramondre Stevenson did last year, adding the receiving component and becoming a potential Uber back, one of those guys who, especially if things break right and the Patriots use him the way it seems like they'll use him, he's one of the players who can jump to Uber back status this year and be a star. He made that step in year 2. Javonte Williams obviously plays for a handful of games and misses. But Colm, the thing that I wanted to really bring out is that this wasn't some kind of a fluke. When you look at Javonte and you look at that rookie season, he was extraordinary as a college player at North Carolina. So one of the things recently when we were talking about Travis Etienne as a potential breakout guy this year, and he's already valued as someone who needs to score well. But when we're looking at Travis Etienne, can he become the next Jamal Charles? Comparing him head-to-head with Bijan Robinson in college, and one of the things that you see is that he crushed Bijan in terms of yards after contact per attempt, in terms of evasion rate, in terms of yards per route, when we look at their two peak seasons next to each other. And I don't think that people have too many questions about Bijan. When you think about Etienne, before a couple of those things that sort of derailed his career, I mean, you were looking at a potential star. That's why you can mention him in the same conversation with Jamal Charles, because his numbers were that good. His athleticism is that good. His ability to catch the ball and make big plays in the passing game, again, that good. The interesting thing here, when we pull in Javonte Williams, is that his evasion rate even higher. Just extraordinary numbers when you look in college, a 46% evasion rate. A lot of the guys coming out who are even people that are being emphasized over the last couple of seasons will have evasion rates in the mid to high 20s, and those are good numbers, right? Bijan last year, one of the reasons people are excited about him, an evasion rate of 32%. Those are good numbers. Yards per out, also better than Bijan Robinson. Rushing yards after contact per attempt, also better than Bijan Robinson. So when we're looking at this player who has dual threat ability, and you look at the receiving component that he put up just in week 1 last year, it's interesting because now we're starting to look at Williams as really a potential star, as opposed to a guy who, will get you some points. And then it's a question of, how will the Sean Payton offense work for him? We know that's been very favorable for running backs in the past. How will Russell Wilson be a fit, not only with Sean Payton, but then getting the ball out to the backs? We're starting to look at the specific scheme there in Denver as being the key to potentially unlocking a monster season.
Yeah, so when you mentioned a number of things there just at the very end, and I think a lot of those things are the reason for where his price is. So I mentioned the injury part. You mentioned, the new head coach, but part of that is kind of the the old system and regime smell is still on a lot of these players. There's the concerns with playing with Russell Wilson, how that might affect the running back from a pass catching perspective. And I think a lot of that is getting overlooked. The other part that's probably keeping that ADP down a little bit is the fact that they did sign Samaje Perine early in the free agent process. But you mentioned in the article that he is also a target, an option to get onto those rosters. We'll be drafting him quite a bit as well. But it's really intriguing to see the change in ADP of both of those guys since that kind of March time when he would have signed, where Perine is rising up boards. We see Javonte go down a little bit, and they're not that far apart in terms of where they are going overall in drafts. We see in the FFPC formats, kind of 7th round ranges, the RB28 is where we're seeing Williams go off the board. You do, with that pass catching element, mention Alvin Kamara in this. He's going at this point in his career around the same point. And I just feel like it's a really, it stands out as a crazy value at this particular point in time that he is, every single potential negative has been focused on, I think, with Javonte rather than the positives that you've highlighted in this particular piece. So I'm definitely on board. The final question I have, though, when it comes to that backfield, a really strong preference to get Javonte at his price or Perine, that kind of round or round and a half later. I think the better player by far in this, what the profile is Williams. There is upside for Perine, but Perine is one of those sort of players that when Javonte is going in the 5th round, you want to target Perine at his current price rather than when they're both going a round apart.
The thing that's been a little bit surprising to me is that drafters have definitely made an adjustment, but I don't necessarily know that it's the correct adjustment, in that if you look at the FFPC ADP tracking tool, you can see Javonte Williams rising from that point, and you can see Perine starting to fall, but it hasn't been dramatic. Now, I should mention that in the drafts that I have done, Javonte has gone quite a bit higher than he was going before, and Perine often does get back to me at prices that I would have previously pulled the trigger on. One of the things here, too, is just that doesn't necessarily suggest that we should have been all in on Williams or that the Perine shares are a mistake. I really like having a lot of both, because then you're going to get the winner who right now looks like Javonte, but very easily could still end up being Perine. You're going to get that player at a very good price at that time. And then even the loser, you're actually fine with having drafted them above what the ADP is, because you still expect meaningful production there and you still have a very strong contingency-based play. One of the things that I mentioned here, and I mentioned it more as a ceiling type of outcome, not this is what we should expect, but you look at what happened in Seattle, and they were consistently among the bottom teams in the NFL in receiving expected points, specifically to the running back when Russell Wilson was there. But that actually jumped to 9th for him last year with Denver. So already, even before the Sean Payton influence this season, you had witnessed a shift in terms of how Russell Wilson was playing. But the other part of that is just that the Saints always created a huge amount of value for the running backs. Now, some of that obviously is going to be Drew Brees, who will not be coming with Sean Payton. But you look at the 2017 season, for example, where you have Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram, 17.4 expected points for Kamara, 13.8 for Ingram. Colm, you're looking at that stretch where Alvin Kamara was the star in New Orleans, and he had either Mark Ingram or Latavius Murray behind him. During that stretch, and obviously it was the earlier stretch in that time period where it was Kamara and Ingram, you have 17.4 EP for Kamara, 13.8 for Ingram. Later on, when you get Latavius Murray, he's in that 8.3 range. All of those guys outperformed their volume. You can easily get a situation where Perine's sort of average scoring level is still in that 10 point per game range. My belief or contention would be that when you look at what Perine did in college, you look at what he did when he was finally given a real NFL chance last season, and then you look at the fact that Mark Ingram was always one of these guys who was a bigger name than he was an actual performer. I don't know there's really much, if any, difference between Mark Ingram and Samaje Perine, who, again, is a perfect fit for what Denver wants to do. I think you can draft both of those guys, but it's surprising to me. I mentioned the FFPC tracking. When you look over there at Underdog, he's jumped about 8 slots since the news came out. I would have expected that to be closer to a round and a half. And so you still have some time to load up on Javonte Williams if you're a believer in his talent and if you're a believer in the Denver running game.
Moving on now, Shawn, to 2 rookie players, and I think we'll go with the one that we haven't talked about as much. We have drafted him on a few shows that we've done together recently, but we'll go with him. We'll save the one that people may be expecting to be in here at the end. I'm wondering if anyone will be able to guess exactly that. But this information is coming from the piece on the website looking at who the next George Kittle may be. That's the guy we're going to talk about at the end, and it's how to perpetually reload that roster with the sleeper wide receiver. So we're looking at the sleeper wide receiver, Shawn. This is an article that focuses on the rookie startup drafts and who has been drafted across the 5 teams that you have, with different members of kind of the RotoViz teams and the podcast kind of side of things. Our team's in there. The other players can be talked about in our team. Shawn, there's only 2 teams that you didn't draft this particular player in, and one of them was with me. That is Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, Shawn's a Chiefs fan, but what's the inside scoop here on Rashee Rice for this season? There's a lot of Sky Moore versus Rashee Rice conversations going on social media at the moment.
And we weren't able to pull the trigger on Rice because we did make that trade that we covered for the podcast. Anybody who wants more depth on that, check that out. Colm will link that for you. But we made the move with some of our second round picks to get Kenneth Walker. We'll see if that pans out. It does give us another potential star running back. Colm, we're recording this on Monday early afternoon, and the news on the Seattle running backs has been unfortunate. Both guys going down. So if you were drafting both of them,
running backs left in Seattle.
If you were drafting them,
worst nightmare.
He's like, we can use a second round pick on a running back again in 2024, and we'll get that market cornered sometime. That's unfortunate because obviously Walker, an impending star, Charbonnet, someone who does have some interesting traits and interesting contingency-based play, again, where he is being drafted. We'll see how they develop. We'll see if our Walker trade makes sense. But Colm, for the 6 leagues, I was able to grab Rashee Rice. We've been doing a lot on the podcast, on Perpetual Reloading. I've gotten a lot of great feedback for the Dynasty series in general, and especially thinking about it through that lens. One of the things, and this was kind of the framework for the article in the first place, is that one of the things Perpetual Reloading allows us to do is to move around, especially in the second round, but even in the first round, where we have a lot of picks as well. Move around, you hit the right tiers to get the strongest players at their positions relative to other guys. So we'll go, as you mentioned, discuss how we really executed that early in the second round at the end. But in the mid to late second round, the prices that we got on Rice, 207, 206, 208, and 210, you and I didn't draft him. The other league where I didn't get him, he went at the 111. And so that was going to be a little bit above where we were targeting. It's still very possible that that pick could work out. You think about where Sky Moore went the previous year. And I mean, part of this is just going to be hindsight, right? But there's not a significantly worse argument for Rice than there was for Moore. You get similar situations in that these guys are small school players. So that introduces some risk for you. With Rice, you have someone who a huge part of his thesis comes from that final year. And we know that fourth-year breakout guys, and then I think especially if you're going to look at it from a small school perspective, that introduces a lot of risk. But Rice was one of these guys who was actually dynamic last season. And we have some wide receivers who were drafted even in the first round, but then especially in the second round, who don't really fit that category. You've got good size at 6'1", 204. You've got impressive final year production. You're talking about 96 receptions, 1,355 yards, 10 touchdowns. And one of the things I thought was interesting when you hear the way he's pigeonholed sometimes, his usage was well balanced between the short, intermediate, deep targets. And when you have that, when you have a guy with a 41-inch vertical, he's going to be open when he's standing on the field for Patrick Mahomes. So certainly then when you get some of the positive buzz from players. And Colm, one of the things I thought was pretty interesting when I was, again, looking at how ADPs have been moving in the last handful of days, the big risers who jump out on the Chiefs, you have Sky Moore rising, you have Justyn Ross rising. He's somebody who is generating some buzz because he appears to be healthy for a little stretch here, and he's getting some first team snaps. That's pretty relevant.
The other thing I'll say is that I haven't seen many players out there, Shawn, that aren't generating positive buzz over the last 5 days.
So we do get a lot of enthusiasm.
The Chiefs at the moment, if we take them as an example, like every single one of their wide receivers is like ready for the Hall of Fame.
Well, Richie James is the other player there too, who again is rising. So we're getting big rising numbers for a lot of these guys. Now, again, kind of where you are in the draft is going to allow you to have more room to rise. Justyn Ross, Richie James going essentially from undrafted into this range where they become pretty trendy 16, 17, 18th round picks. The Chiefs have been trying to talk up Sky Moore. Again, we do know that he does have some athleticism and did some good things in college, but we also know that when you disappoint to the level that he did as a rookie, history is stacked against you. Now, I would always encourage people to look at this also on a player-specific basis. So when you look at Treylon Burks, for example, and say, okay, he doesn't have the numbers that you need for a rookie when you're going to project them to a breakout, there are so many extenuating circumstances there. And Burks was such a big-time prospect that part doesn't worry me as much for him. Now, bringing in DeAndre Hopkins in an offense that still could be fairly run-oriented, that creates some volume problems. So it's not that in any way, shape, or form Burks is out of the woods, but you just want to take the specifics of the situation when you're thinking through those guys and you're making your decisions. With Moore, I think you have some threat here. Number one, I mean, Richie James may just be better at that role where they have some overlap on. But especially when you're starting to hear that Rice is impressing in camp, he's getting a lot of first-team snaps, that he and guys like Justyn Ross might be able to put more pressure on the defense than some of the guys who would appear to be locked into more volume. It's one of the reasons why MVS is not a trendy player in fantasy and hasn't been throughout this entire draft season. Now, are there some drafters out there who maybe are going running back heavy and then are saying, I mean, look, we're probably going to get the Chiefs wide receiver 1 almost for free, and we're going to go ahead and take that and have that work? Yeah, that's a scenario that you have to keep in mind. It is a scenario that's possible, but is drawing to a pretty narrow scenario, given what we know about MVS, his overall profile, and how he fit in with Kansas City last year, where he did not make the kind of impact that they would have been looking for from him. You get back to Rice, and it's interesting to hear Matt Nagy talk about him. He says Rice comes from a no-huddle offense there at SMU, but it's a little bit different with the tempo as here and now. Getting to the line of scrimmage, running your route, having conversations with it, and being on time, jogging back, doing it again. He came in phenomenal shape. He's made incremental improvements. It's exciting because the sky's the limit for his talent. And this offers a contrast for us when we think back to some of the minicamp stuff where Rice was struggling with his conditioning. So this is a really cool note, I think, for somebody who his initial days with the NFL players had some struggles, but then his first real and meaningful opportunity, the first time it's going to matter a ton, he comes in and he's ready to play. Again, you have to consider what Patrick Mahomes can do for these guys if they are in fact good. I mean, he's been succeeding with very limited weapons at the receiving position. Now, obviously, you have Travis Kelce, and so not a lot of teams are going to feel sorry for the Chiefs and what they actually have there outrunning routes. But when you're looking at the receivers, there is a huge opportunity. One of the things that you and I talk a lot about, Colm, is that there is some risk to being early, but there's also a huge potential reward, because once you're starting to draft these guys with mature prices, yeah, they can still have good seasons, right? But you look at Garrett Wilson, you look at Chris Olave, you look at some of the guys in that range. I mean, they have to have huge years to justify those prices. I mean, you're basically just saying, I think these guys can hang with the veterans. You're not necessarily saying you're going to be able to crush ADP from there, because, it's baked in. And so when we look at how you're going to beat ADP on these players, we have to look at guys who are in good situations where they have this combination of talent and skill that is impressive and where the payoff could be very significant.
100%. And it goes back to kind of what we mentioned with Javonte Williams and you talking about, has this player an opportunity to jump up in the future year's draft? And you're looking at somebody coming in as a rookie. You mentioned the two perfect examples for this year and Olave and Wilson. There's such an opportunity for somebody to come in and step up and become the wide receiver one for the Chiefs. We kind of have dreamed about it in the last couple of years about who could do that, especially since Tyreek Hill was no longer there. And it has been a committee and nobody has really stepped up. You mentioned MBS as well, and he is kind of showing what we've seen of him at the Packers, a role player who will stretch the field from time to time and has some struggles staying healthy. So he's not going to step up and jump up to that next level. We've seen Juju Smith-Schuster there last year. But you mentioned the point of being early, and at the current prices that are available for Rice, and we are, I'm still certainly going to be drafting Sky Moore. I believe you're still in the boat of draft him as well. Am I correct on that?
I have a pretty strong share of Sky Moore right now. And as I'm looking at this, I'm probably pretty comfortable sticking there and letting that balance out a little bit as he rises. Colm, the implied element here that we should mention quickly is that these guys are all rising in part because Kadarius Toney is very much a question mark now.
Has been a question mark for his NFL career.
He has been. And
talented maybe question mark.
A very talented question mark, especially with the ball in his hands, but very limited really in terms of the other types of things that he can do. When you look at his already limited profile, maybe the most shocking thing to me over the last week has not been the rise from these other Chiefs weapons, but that Kadarius Toney has not fallen a ton. I moved him down like 70 spots in my rankings, and he has dropped like 15 to 20 spots in terms of where you're generally seeing him go. There's a big gap there. I don't think that you can draft Toney in any way, shape, or form right now. And I'll be glad if I'm wrong, because it'll be great for the Chiefs. It'll be great for him. You want the player to succeed. You don't want injuries to take guys out of their career and really, what their life is for them.
The other thing that's tricky about because there is so many wide receiver options kind of floating around the Chiefs, you named out pretty much all of them now. Then you have Travis Kelce in the mix. Realistically, we're going to hopefully get one really amazing wide receiver to come out of the rookie or the second year option in Sky Moore. But when we're looking then through the rest of it, it's kind of a case of like not all of these guys are going to be productive, but their ADPs are also in ranges where you do need them to be productive. And that's where I think the bet on Rice and Justyn Ross, we would love to see have that impact. We'll see how long he can stay healthy as well. But the Chiefs, if they come away with a wide receiver one, and we're looking at a situation like the Jets, for example, or the Saints with Wilson and Olave, like as you mentioned a moment ago with his talent, but the sky is the limit if one of these guys can actually step forward and take the opportunity. And I think if you are a true NFL wide receiver one, that's what should happen. We've seen that with Wilson, we've seen that with Olave, and we've seen that with all the guys who come through. Even in a situation where you do have T. Higgins, we see that with Jamar Chase. We had a situation where there was a lot of veteran wide receivers in Minnesota. We've seen that with Jamar Chase. The true wide receivers are going to step up, and out of that group, it feels like Rice is the only one that's really a possibility with.
And this is certainly in no way, shape, or form us saying that we think that Rice will be at the level of those guys.
No.
But you could
the
get
potential
him
is there.
The potential for him to take a big jump is there and to be the Chiefs wide receiver one. Now, that won't necessarily still compete with the star wide receiver ones around the NFL, but because it's such a great opportunity with Patrick Mahomes, the fantasy outcomes there for you, whether you're looking at a full season or looking for some individual shot weeks at the end, very, very high.
We're going to get into the last guy now, Shawn, see if anyone has guessed it. It's a tight end. It's a rookie. It's the next George Kittle, according to George Kittle. It is Sam LaPorta. We have talked about LaPorta at length through the draft process. Some people, obviously, Shawn, we know some people will be coming in now to start getting their fantasy fix at this point of the year. We have a great community here at RotoViz OT that are here pretty much all year long, but anyone that's in now, we're going to talk a little bit about Sam LaPorta. So LaPorta, obviously, we kind of everything, Shawn, we hoped at the draft process time. He's coming into an ideal landing spot. There is other competent players around him at the skill positions, but it really set up where if he came in and hit the ground running, he could be the tight end one on this offense straight away, who's had a major leap forward last year in terms of offensive production, and we would hope to see something similar continue again. Not a jump this year, but to stay at that same level. So everything that we have talked about in the past, the profile, how he would fit in the NFL, it's probably gone as good as it possibly could have gone to this point through camp.
It's been fantastic. And just again, to create a little bit of a baseline, and when you're thinking about the potential for a guy to blow up, Sam LaPorta is somebody 91st percentile 40, 90th percentile cone, 89th percentile broad jump. So you're talking about a freak athlete here. And a lot of fantasy managers like that, and for good reason. But you need the guy to be able to play. And so then you look at what he did. I mentioned that he was the perfect arbitrage guy on the two higher profile prospects. That was pre-draft, right? Somebody who broke more tackles than either guy last year, more yards after the catch and after contact than Mayer. Back-to-back seasons with 600 receiving yards. Finishes with a career yardage share of 25%. I mean, these are crazy numbers for a tight end. And then you come out and you have this situation where the offensive coordinator is talking about how, we're a team that makes you earn that starting role or even taking reps with the first team. But he did that even before training camp. And so now he's taking the first team reps in training camp. And then you have head coach Dan Campbell talking about how LaPorta and Gibbs, those guys, he thinks they look perfect in terms of potentially developing together, that the halfback and the tight end combo is perfect for beating the types of defenses that you're seeing out there now. We know that they used the tight ends in kind of an interesting fashion after they make the move to trade Hawkinson. Obviously, they create a ton of value for the running backs last year. I think this is an interesting note. It's one actually we also had sent to us by a listener who had an article submission, and I'm going to be getting back to him. I really appreciate those. Anybody who does listen and is interested in writing for the site, I mean, we can't necessarily get everybody out there going, and we're not making promises, obviously, but we've had a lot of people come through as readers, come through as listeners, and then end up as the stars of our writing team. So that path is there. August, obviously a fun time to write about football. And even the submissions that we aren't able to publish and that type of thing, we really appreciate. They're very, very interesting. So don't hesitate to send us those. Colm, I mean, Sam LaPorta seems like the potential guy to go out there and get some points. And one of the things that I mentioned in the article is kind of talking about him and even a little bit how we look at Dalton Kincaid and Michael Mayer is that you have some of these guys looking at a Pitts, looking at Evan Ingram, a Jordan Reed, and Aaron Hernandez. You have players who come out, and especially I think in that LaPorta sort of mold where they score pretty well as rookies. So I mention Blair's research all the time, which emphasizes year 2 for these types of prospects. That's very intuitive. You mentioned, Colm, that you like the guys in year 3, and that is the second most likely year. So you can still get some of those third-year guys. Again, we see that in Blair's research. You want to be careful not to overdraft these players in redraft, and yet to be willing to consider the fact that that's the direction that the NFL is moving, and especially when tight end scoring is so low after you get past the first 3 or 4 guys. If someone is the right fit and is good enough, I mean, the season we got a couple years ago from Pitts, even in what wasn't necessarily a great environment, that's not going to be the last time we see that. I mean, Pitts is a good tight end prospect, but he is not the first, nor is he going to be the last of the athletic tight ends who can come out and make an impact early.
Yeah, we're going to see a lot more of them coming out through college over the next decade. I'm sure of that. So very, very excited to see what LaPorta can do there. You mentioned, obviously, I do tend to like to wait a little bit on the tight end, but you also made the point on this episode where it's better to be early than to be, buying them up next year when we're in, 4th round, 5th round trying to get them. So very, very excited for Sam LaPorta. We'll track all these guys as we go through the offseason. Well, I'm sure we'll hear a lot more puff pieces coming out about some of the players. That's always a little bit of trying to decipher which ones to pay attention to, which ones to not. But that's something that in Shawn's articles, he does a fantastic job of really getting to the I think the coach quotes that are really getting down to the nitty gritty. So always awesome. Both of the articles that we mentioned today will be linked in today's show notes. I'll also link the podcast that Shawn mentioned about what we kind of had to do to get Kenneth Walker to give up that pick that we could have potentially got Rashee Rice with. So I'll share that if people are interested in going back and listening to that. That will do us for this episode of RotoViz OT. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work, including the pieces I mentioned today, on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.